Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Okay. This is the first cut, I guess you could say, at constructing a mental map of the morality, or maybe a better way to say immorality of abortion, looking at the moral questions. What I'm trying to do is survey all of the different moral questions that come up that are connected with abortion. And it's like trying to come up with the topography, I guess you could say, and even in topography, you can get a lot of details. We're not quite there yet, and I don't have a picture to show yet. So this is just a matter of putting things together. The first fundamental question about human life, it seems to me, is does it have innate value, or is the value purely instrumental? And what I mean by instrumental value is we value things based on how they serve us. You know, what benefit do we get from them? And if that's our picture of human life, that's not very good, because people that don't give us what we want are not worth anything to us. Whereas the inherent value concept helps us to appreciate that everyone has innate value, and we may not be able to derive any benefit from their existence directly, but we do in the long run when we finally meet our Maker. There are a number of questions that come up, or moral issues that come up based on the stage of gestation, and the questions that come up are different if you have an innate value or an inherent value picture versus an instrumental value picture. There are many gaps in informed consent. When women present themselves to an abortion clinic, they are often given a story, a sales pitch, you might say, and whether they have questions or not, they generally don't really understand all the implications of what they're about to do. The role of government is very complicated in this area. Before I finish, I figured I would talk about, in a general way, the secular picture versus Christian picture of these issues. And then at the last slide, I wanted to review something that I did at the 40 Days for Life meeting, where I talked about the relationship between the parable of the sower and the seed, and how we approach bringing this question up to people. The most obvious question about a human being is it different in some fundamental way from animals? And we can take that back to the very beginning of life and ask ourselves, as people did when I was young, are we talking about tissue, or are we talking about something more than that? And it seems to me that we've already answered that question, but not everybody thinks of a fetus as anything more than tissue. That still is a misconception in our society. We're not just an animal either, because we are endowed with an immortal soul. That's my position as a Catholic priest. We are endowed with an immortal soul. So that makes us fundamentally different. And a third consideration, of course, is even if it's true, and I think this is still an unsettled question, even if it's true that human life is not endowed at the moment of conception with an immortal soul, nevertheless, this is something in God's intention, God's plan, that we are life. We are entirely human at the moment of conception. And it's not our job to decide whether to discard or to keep. It's our God-given job to be stewards of this unique human person. If we look at the instrumental value perspective, many questions come up in the life of a mother, a potential mother. She's going to consider, is this new life that's growing inside of me a convenience in my life plan? What potential value is this new human being going to have? Are they going to have gifts? Are they going to have defects? These questions arise in the decision that they make. Bad genes or good genes? Are there going to be defects in gestation or in delivery? How costly is this person going to be to me at various stages? And of course, if we have an instrumental perspective, we have no problem with finding ways of bringing about a new birth if that new birth is a convenience in my life plan. Should I go as far as IVF? Should I go as far as surrogacy? These things are the kind of perspective that says that I can do anything whatsoever with a human being, applying any methodology of science, and so that leaves open all sorts of human experimentation. It even leaves open things like fetal body parts harvesting. And finally, if I have an instrumental perspective, what is my motivation for adopting a child? Is it an instrumental motivation, or is there an abundance of love in my life that I want to share? Stage of gestation issues. There are many stages in gestation. Abortifacient contraceptives and IUDs prevent implantation, even of a fertilized egg. There are other mechanisms involved, like making the uterus inhospitable to new life, including sperm cells. RU-486 is an example of a, I don't think they have the term here, but there is a technology associated with RU-486 that I'll be getting to later, I think. And then there are methods of performing an abortion early on. We used to call it scraping the tubes back in my youth. Nowadays they call it dilation and extraction, dilation and curettage. Beyond that point, you get to a dismemberment abortion. And beyond that point, the usual technique is to induce fetal demise, followed by induced labor. And the worst form of that, of course, is partial birth abortion. And if you have an instrumental perspective, like folks in ancient Sparta, or Dr. Peter Singer, or President Obama, or Kermit Gosnell, you think nothing of post-birth abortion, which we would call infanticide. Let's think about gaps in informed consent. Informed consent is a fundamental principle in medical ethics. If you're going to do any kind of operation on someone, any kind of treatment, You want them to be well informed about the benefits and the costs. But those women that present themselves to an abortion clinic typically are missing serious points. In particular, as I mentioned, I was going to get to some of the technology. Birth control pills, especially abortifacients, as well as IUDs, can be endocrine disruptors. Endocrinology is one of the areas of medicine that is growing in sophistication, and there are certain endocrine artificial chemicals that substitute for natural hormonal chemicals, and they bind to sites that prevent natural hormonal action, and the result is making it impossible to carry a child. And unfortunately, there are also a lot of side effects of this sort of thing, and the side effects are usually, I imagine, not much discussed, certainly not at any kind of a technical level. There's a serious imbalance between men and women in terms of risk assumption. The early research on male contraceptions, male contraceptive pills and technologies was quickly abandoned. Did you know that? It was quickly abandoned because there were side effects that were deemed unacceptable. Now that's a relative thing, isn't it? Unacceptable. Unacceptable for men didn't turn out to be unacceptable for women. Women have been convinced that contraceptive use and abortion are liberating and empowering, even though there's, as I said, there's a justice issue and who takes on the risk. And the impact on male behavior, since the man takes on less risk, the result is that his behavior tends to change. And so if he's going to be taking on less risk, what's going on, he's going to take on more risky behavior because he won't have to face the consequences of the risk. And that's an example of what's called moral hazard. You should write that term down if you're not familiar with it. Look it up, moral hazard. And that very thing was discussed in Humanae Vitae, paragraph 17. Although Pope Paul VI didn't use the term moral hazard. That's a term in insurance. There is a serious gap in informed consent for surgical abortions because of there's risk involved in surgical abortion. There are potential medical complications, and of course, there's been an effort of pro-life people to make sure that a woman who's considering an abortion gets to see their child with an ultrasound. And pro-abortion people have fought this tremendously, because they don't want informed consent, so no ultrasound. And there's another area of misinformation in the area of medical necessity. When is an abortion actually medically necessary? And there's a lot of misinformation on that. What sort of things are left out of consideration in informed consent? Well, there's abortion's aftermath. There's potential uterine damage during an abortion, emotional, spiritual damage, an impact on hormone balance relating to these endocrine disruptors, impact on breast cancer, potential impact on breast cancer. Botched abortions have often led to death or serious crippling problems. Relationships can be damaged, irreparable when an abortion is sought as a solution. And of course, this perspective has led to, as I mentioned, IVF and what happens to the egg cells that are not kept, or not, I should say, implanted, that are kept, right? They're kept in freezers. That's called cryogenics. But their fate is certainly not decided at that point, except in you can think of it as a kind of deferred abortion. Tubal pregnancy was mentioned in this last talk. It's an example of ectopic pregnancy outside of the womb. It surprised me to find out that it's preventable. That's something that I invite you to investigate. Tubal pregnancy can be prevented with proper care before that possibility happens. Rape and incest. The relationship to mental health of the mother and the victim is a serious issue regarding whether the abortion is medically necessary, and a lot of people can make hasty decisions based on the potential impact of pregnancy of the mother if she's considered not able to handle a child, and so forth and so on. Hasty judgments can be made about whether that abortion is medically necessary. If there is a potential for maternal stress from preeclampsia, autoimmunity issues, uterine cancer, if she has uterine cancer, it could be decided that there's unacceptable risk due to stress to the mother if the pregnancy is carried out to completion. So these are the kinds of questions that come up in examining whether an abortion is medically necessary. And famously, C. Everett Koop, I forget what administration was he under? Nixon? Reagan. He was under Reagan. Said that there's no case that he was aware of where abortion was actually medically necessary. Now, first question about the role of government is who decides. In the statist perspective, it's the state that decides whether an abortion is necessary, such as in China and to a lesser extent in India. China's one-child policy is now a two-child policy. It's still a statist decision. The question of, or the perspective of radical individualism, the feminist position would be that the mother makes the decision with no input from the father. Paternalist position would be the father makes the decision with no input from the mother. In radical individualism. In theism, if we consider that God has an interest in this child. That means that the parents are not the owners of the child, the mother is not the owner of the child. They are mere stewards of this gift. In tribalism or clanism, families make decisions like that. Involvement of the free market, what happens? Well, you have surrogacy. That's typically a free market kind of thing. Sperm and egg donation and IVF. All of these things involve the free market in making decisions about survival of the fertilized egg or of the fetus. And of course, the government has a key role in regulation. The saying in the Roe v. Wade decision, leading up to the Roe v. Wade decision, was they wanted to make abortion safe, legal, and rare. Licensing and certifications, transfer agreements. Transfer agreements has to do with when situations arise in the clinic that present a threat to the life of the mother, there have to be transfer agreements. In other words, there has to be some means of getting the woman to a hospital where they can be treated properly. And in some cases, I think there are people here that can let you know that that's not always respected. The government is involved in monitoring and inspecting abortion clinics, and sometimes they are motivated ideologically to look the other way. That's certainly what happened in the Gosnell case. And then, of course, there's a question of who pays for services, the government or the people who want to see the abortion. The government has an impact on demanding that insurance covers it and so forth. And there's a huge impact on freedom of speech and assembly in this question. Government can impose restrictions on speech and assembly in opposing abortion. Now let's compare secular versus Christian values. I've got two slides looking at the secular side and one looking at the Christian side. There are basically three starting points in the secular world that are connected with this pro-choice business. Progressivism was discussed in great detail this morning, especially the roots in eugenics and euthanasia. But of course, progressivism is kind of this starting point for economics and ecology, the economics and ecology of population growth. Secular humanism is kind of, you could say, progressivism's successor. Secular humanism has led to social experimentation and identity politics. Transhumanism, if you're not familiar with the term transhumanism, you should look it up. Genetic tinkering and cybernetics. You may have been familiar with a lot of science fiction in the past few decades that had, especially, for example, in Star Trek and Star Wars, cyborgs. You've heard the term cyborgs. Basically combining technologies, electronic technologies with humans so that we incorporate those. We have implantations and so forth that change our nature. And of course, whatever statist approach you have, there's a perspective that we can call elitism. In the Christian perspective, Jesus talked about servant leadership. elitists are leaders, but what do they serve? They serve a utopian vision. And the utopian vision implies that eugenics is necessary and so forth. And finally, we come to a Christian perspective. Human life is valued for its own sake in Christianity. Solidarity among human beings is a fundamental value. Stewardship is a fundamental value. These are quotations from Genesis that give us a very early picture of these values. There are 60 million unborn children that lost their lives during abortion in the last, since Roe v. Wade, as I understand it. And the last slide, sowing the gospel of life. You're all familiar with the parable of the sower and the seed, right? The sower went out to sow. Some seed fell along the path. Well, I maintain that Jesus' images can be thought of as metaphors, and if they are metaphors, what are they metaphors of? It seems to me that the footpath is a metaphor for culture, because it's where everybody goes. Everybody walks on the footpath. So it's an excellent metaphor for culture. What he described of what happens to the gospel message is very aptly connected with culture, because what he said was that the birds of the sky eat up the seed before it can germinate. And as he said, the birds of the sky was a metaphor for the devils. And we can understand that the demonic influence on culture is a very important example of how life-affirming ideas can get swallowed up. Some seed fell on rocky ground. The biblical meaning of that essentially is stony hearts. Well, we can think of it in a modern term as narcissism. Some seed fell among thorns. We can think of that as material ambition. For example, in an earlier slide I mentioned, is this new life convenient for me? Very often material ambition leads to saying no. Well, how do you respond to people in these three different areas? In the area of culture, get to know and understand culture. And that's one of the things we're trying to do here today. In the case of narcissism, it's important for us to recognize that it's not necessarily the case that somebody who's narcissistic at the age of 18 is going to be narcissistic for the rest of their life. What they have is delayed personality development. They're not lost necessarily, but it can help to understand personality development to see where to take the dialogue next. Material ambition, get to know and understand economy and government. Most material ambition is realized somewhere in the economy or in government. If you understand these things, you can understand what's going on in somebody's material ambitions. And knowing these things as a kind of background can help you to understand where to take the dialogue next. Some seeds fell on good soil, and it seems to me that the best metaphor for that is robust virtue. But if somebody has robust virtue, they'll probably be very open to whatever you have to say. questions.
I just want to make a comment as a pro-life mother who's had a miscarriage, that your statement about the preventative, like that tubal pregnancies are preventable, could be just say that cautiously, because I know lots of pro-life women who have had ectopic pregnancies.
Oh yeah, I'm not saying that it's easy to prevent. I'm just saying there are certain steps that can be taken to reduce the risk. And that kind of information is available.
Right. I mean, it's also an interesting process trying to conceive when you want to have a child and realizing you have no control over where it implants, and like you have to trust God on that. So.
I was going to also ask about, when you were talking about secularistic values, on the chief things also, chief influencers of the secularistic values are the so-called consumer values that we've been invited to displace our traditional cultural values, much of which see man derived from Karl Marx's view that man is merely an economic animal, is only valuable for what he's able to produce or consume.
Yeah, that's a purely instrumental
His
perspective.
view was totally instrumentalist.
Right.
It's definitely one of the influencers, and it's influenced our culture too.
Oh yeah.
I think some of your confreres very famously said that, our culture is probably the most successful Marxist culture that's ever existed.
Well, yeah, that's amazingly ignorant of history, but yeah. Right.
Yeah, well, that's in terms of our viewpoint of human life, that's being merely instrumental. It's the economy stupid. To use a very famous phrase from one of our past presidents.
Yeah. Sounds like it's time for lunch.
Yeah, this